going to do chapter 15 pretty quick. I don't want to make it sound like it's not an important chapter, but it's not one you're going to deal with probably in the day-to-day expectations of contractual law the way you deal with some of the previous chapter, but it's still an important chapter, and it's called special bailments. Remember what a bailment is? Basically, one party's possessing another person's property for a limited duration, and the basic baseline of that is basically that the bailee, the one currently possessing it, has to return it to the bailor in the condition upon which they received it, unless it was designed to be left with the bailee to be altered, repaired, or painted, or changed in some way, something like that. But chapter 15 is mostly about carriers. What's a carrier? If I'm buying goods from you and you're out in Arizona, chances are we're going to have to provide for some kind of delivery service. And if you're going to ship the goods to me, you're the seller, but you're also now the shipper. A lot of people, when they hear that word shipper, they think that's the person that's going to actually carry the goods to the purchaser. No, the shipper is simply the seller of the goods, and they're going to arrange to have a carrier take it to the buyer. That carrier could be a private carrier, and then that's all based upon whatever the contract says. And here's a real practical moment. You always have the power, even when it's a public carrier. Public carrier is basically, it can be a private company, but it has to be an entity that's willing to serve all who apply. And FedEx and UPS, the United States Postal Service, these are all public carriers. But there's private ones out there, and they basically discriminate, not based upon race, color, creed, national origin, religion, things like that, but they discriminate in terms of what kind of clientele and services they might be willing to supply. We're mostly good, so we're not going to focus too much on private characters because that's just the individual contract that the shipper, the seller, is going to have with the physical movers, for lack of a better way of saying it. Let's say truckers or some kind of airplane or cars, things like that, however they're going to do it. We're going to talk mostly about common carriers, and the definition is pretty good in your book. It's basically they're willing to serve anyone who applies. It undertakes to transport goods or people without discrimination for all who apply for that service, meaning they don't discriminate. We only do cars or we only do livestock. They are a carrier generally of most goods or persons. And again, the consignor, it's a language issue. It's open book test, so I don't get too worried about it. The consignor is also the shipper, usually also the seller. The consignee is going to be the recipient, also usually the buyer or the purchaser of the goods. And the bill of lading is the contract between the shipper or seller and the actual physical carrier of the goods. And here's a real practical moment. You can always shift liability or change liability in the bill of lading. All bill of lading is basically the contract, again, between the shipper and the carrier that's actually going to carry the goods. Public carriers, in order to have that limitation that they put into their risk of loss, has to have the government approve it. Those of you who have ever flown on a plane or gone on Amtrak and you check baggage, there's often a limitation right on the agreement that liability be only for a certain amount of money. They can't just do that of their own accord and contract with you. They have to get the government's permission to do that. Common carriers need to be able to basically have a check on them by the government to make sure it's fundamentally fair. As a general principle, once the shipper delivers the goods to the carrier, if it's a public carrier, they are almost strictly liable now. So I bring the goods, I'm selling phones or something like that, I bring it over to the carrier. If it's a public carrier and something happens during transport, I am not going to bear the risk of loss, nor would the buyer bear the risk of loss. Who would? The carrier would, unless it meets the 5 exceptions. And the book does a nice job of this. Act of God. This is basically, say it's a trucking company, it's a public carrier, and a bolt of lightning comes down and it strikes the trailer and the goods all get burned up. They would not be liable under those circumstances. But who would be? Usually the seller. The buyer usually doesn't bear liability until it's delivered to the location upon which it was agreed upon, whether it's the buyer's address or whether it's a warehouse where the buyer will at least have an opportunity to retrieve those goods. So an act of God, just like it sounds unusual, it has to be unexpected. If we know there's a giant snowstorm going through and the carrier decides to drive through it, they will remain liable because there's not an act of God in terms of a unanticipated event. They knew about the event. Acts of a public authority. Say I'm shipping fruit from California and I'm shipping it out to the eastern seaboard, and maybe there's a rare fly that somehow came over from another country and it's invading the crops of California where I'm selling from, and the government may seize those goods and destroys them. The carrier is not going to be liable under that circumstance, not strictly. So basically, it's like a strict liability unless one of these exceptions apply. One, act of God. Two is act of a public authority. The next one is inherent nature of the goods. This one is difficult to wrestle with by a lot of people, students especially, because it's new to them. But sometimes goods, by their very nature, just will deteriorate or be destroyed by the very nature. I always think of very, very delicate flowers. No matter how well we pack them, no matter how well we put them in the carrier's possession, and no matter how well the carrier takes care of them, sometimes a certain percentage of the delicate things like orchids will likely perish in transport. That's true of also livestock. A lot of people are surprised, but there's an expectation that a certain number of livestock won't make it from point A to point B over a long distance trip just because animals in transport don't always do so well, no matter how well the carrier tries to provide for them. Inherent nature of the goods. Some things just spoil. And again, another practical moment. What do you want to do when you're dealing with this? Always have contractual terms and buy insurance if it's available. Insurance is often very cheap on shipping, and it makes everyone rest easy because I don't want to be the one as the seller. If I put goods in the possession of the carrier, something happens along the way, and the buyer comes up and says, "Hey, where are my goods?" And I said, "Hey, I sent them off." Now I might have to go after the carrier to be made whole. The buyer is certainly going to, and they would be rightly so, they're not going to be liable because it was never ultimately delivered to them or to their location where they could have access to them. So they shouldn't be liable. And now I'm on the hook. So how do we prevent all that? Either you put contractual terms who will bear the risk of loss, you can shift that burden, or you buy insurance. Insurance is, especially if it's something of significant value. You don't want to lose sleep at night thinking that something terrible is going to happen to the goods in transport. The next one is act of the shipper. This is pretty interesting. It happens to me a few times. I was going to bring a few up here because my daughter bought my house, and one of the nice things about selling my previous house to my daughter was I left half of my stuff there. And one of the things I collect is political memorabilia. One of the oddball things I collect are these things called commemorative plates. I don't know why I collect them other than the fact that they're so cheap. But I had one of Lyndon Baines Johnson, basically, an etching or a picture on a dinner plate of Lyndon Baines Johnson. I guess you'd hang it on the wall. And I remember going to pick it up at the post office when I came in, and it was one of these yellow sort of envelopes, 11 and a half by 17, kind of a long square yellow, and I didn't know what it was. I thought it was some legal document from my law practice, and I picked it up and I could hear all this clinking and clanking and basically broken ceramic sounding things inside the envelope. And I remember opening it up, and all there was a significant amount of dust, a lot of broken sections of plate, and I actually could make out Lyndon Johnson's image in one of the sections of that had survived. And all I was thinking right away, I think I paid $3 for it. It wasn't a big deal to me, so there was no need to worry about insurance or anything like that. But is that act of the carrier? Was it the post office that screwed up? No, whoever the seller was literally slipped in a plate, a dinner plate, into an envelope with no protection, no bubble wrap. It's not the fault of the carrier. The carrier should be excused because it was an act of the shipper in poor manipulation of how the goods should be ultimately delivered to the carrier. The carrier doesn't always know. They get a package. Sometimes they ask. Sometimes at the post office they'll ask, is anything fragile? Is it anything subject to spoilage? Is there anything in here that's petroleum based, something that can potentially ignite under certain temperatures? But think about it. Do people sometimes poorly pack items? Who should bear the loss? Use your common sense. It should be the shipper because the shipper failed to package it the appropriate way. And the last one, which doesn't come up that much, is act of a public enemy. This isn't about bandits or robbers or mobsters that come after the tractor trailer and have it pulled over and steal the goods. We're talking about somebody we're at war with. I guess right now we're technically at war with Al Qaeda. I don't know how it's not really a country. At one time you only could be at war with nations, but generally speaking, this one's not going to come up. It's just not. We haven't had a declared war. And it'll surprise. We've had many wars. We haven't had a declared war since World War II, so that's really not going to come up too much. But it's kind of a straightforward thing. So what's the concept? Shipper, once delivered to the carrier bears the liability if they're a public carrier, which most carriers are. Um, Bills of lading, all that is, I hate these fancy terms because some of you must be reading this stuff and hearing me talking about it. It's like, bill of lading, what the heck is that? All it is the contract between the shipper and the carrier, and they can limit their liability in that contract. But if it's a public carrier, which most are, they have to get the government to consent on the limitations of their liability. We know airlines have that consent. Amtrak has that consent when you carry their goods through there. A straight bill of lading, that means if I say, okay, I am sending this to Jane Doe. If it's a straight bill of lading, only Jane Doe can receive those goods at the other end of the destination. It can't be Bob Smith coming and pick it up. But if it's a negotiable bill of lading or a order bill of lading, just like a check paid to the order of James Corman, what can I do in the back? I can endorse it and have it transferred through negotiation to a third party. That's what's known also as a negotiable or an order bill of lading, where it says, shipped to the order of James Corman. Well, that means I can come pick it up, but guess what else I could put right on it? I could sign that bill of lading, deliver to Jane Doe or Martha Corman or some other person or entity, and that's negotiable. Not a big deal, but I guess you should know it. Common carriers of people. This is an interesting one. I got a quick story for you here. They owe the highest degree of care in transporting people, but it's not perfection. And I have to say the case law has kind of come down on this to be basically they owe a duty of reasonable care in transporting human beings from one place to another. The MART bus near Gardner campus, for example, that's a public common carrier of people. Did that mean they have to supply you a seat? This surprises a lot of people. No, they don't have to supply you a seat because that's not considered necessarily to meet the standard of reasonableness. That's why when you stand, you have those poles and hooks and things that you can hold on to. Anybody's ever rode the MTA up in Boston or the subway system and all those things, oftentimes you're caught standing. And are you able to make the argument if you were to fall and hurt yourself, could you sue them for failing to meet their duty as a common carrier of persons? Probably not, because you're not provided a seat, just provided some safe mode of transportation. And society has determined that standing up is okay. I once stood on an Amtrak train from Springfield, Massachusetts to 30th Street Station in Philadelphia, and I didn't feel safe at all. And I fell down several times just from the fatigue. It was an overbooked train. And I think of another story. My dog Martha is actually named after Martha's Vineyard. All of us hopefully have dreams. That's why we're in college, I think, on some level. But I love Martha's Vineyard. I never stayed overnight, but I've gone many a day trip. And it's brutal because I'm driving out from the Sturbridge area and I go all the way out to the ferry, and I get on the ferry is a common carrier, the public one. There's a private one, but I go on the public one. It's the Steamship Authority. We go over, then we get on, because I don't have any money. Well, not much. I get on the buses, the public buses. So I have me and my 4 kids, and we go and we go on the public buses and go all the way around. And one of the times we're on the bus, I was on the very front, and I wasn't talking to the bus driver, I guess you're not supposed to, but had the same exact sort of visual point as the bus driver. We're going down the road on Martha's Vineyard. There's people walking up and down on the sidewalks. Young girl, maybe 14 or 15, literally decides to just start walking across the street right in front of the bus without any kind of crosswalk or acknowledgement that she was about to do it. The bus driver, I remember slamming on the brakes, and I remember all the people in the back of the bus literally getting ejected out of their seats and flying forward and really piling on everyone up in the front, including my 4 kids. And I remember digging everybody out. No one was serious. Some people actually were seriously injured. There were some cuts and some abrasions. Some people had to leave in ambulances. But I remember digging out 3 of my kids. I'm like, oh, thank God. Then all of a sudden, I remember I had a 4th kid. The youngest one at the time was probably 5 years old. And he was buried under some elderly people. And he came out with a bloody nose. I don't know. I shouldn't be laughing at this, but it was funny because I actually, I don't know why. I guess I blanked out myself. Thought I only had 3 kids with me when I had 4. So I got him out. And I remember my oldest son, who at the time was probably, 13 or 14. And all I kept saying was, Dad, you're going to sue the bus company. You're going to sue the bus company. You're going to sue the bus company. And there was 2 problems with suing the bus company. One problem was they did nothing wrong. They drove reasonably. They actually saved the girl's life when the bus did not hit the girl that crossed right in front of her, but she actually fell over with her bike, and the bus kind of went over the top of her, making no contact. She got up and rode away, scared. I can understand that. She was a young girl. The bus driver wasn't at fault. So that's the first problem. What if the bus driver that's a clear case of saving a human life, and it's a very reasonable type of behavior. But even more so, people might argue, if they read this in the book, that they owe the highest degree of care. They're almost like an insurer of the persons, and if persons get injured during the course of transport, the carrier is going to be liable. That's not true. You have to prove negligence, the failure to act as a reasonable, prudent person would as the carrier of human beings, and that the guy certainly did. My kids still talk about it all the time, that trip back in the day. Now that things are a little bit better, I actually bring my vehicle over because my kids want all their stuff in the SUV, and we pack a ton of stuff, and that way I don't have to stop at as many restaurants along the way. Duty to provide reasonable accommodations. Again, not necessarily do what share, believe it or not, but it has to be reasonable protection. Hotel keepers also have a heightened duty of care beyond what we usually consider as reasonable, but I have to admit, most of the jury instructions that go to jurors on this is they have to do what's reasonable and prudent under circumstance to protect the hotel patrons and your belongings. Now, because there's been a lot of historical lawsuits over people coming into hotels and say, I had a $5 million diamond necklace, or I had a ton of money and I put it in my hotel room, and I come back after dinner and my stuff was stolen, I am now going to sue the hotel because they didn't keep my goods in their utmost care. So we provided pretty much nationwide principle where hotels can reduce their liability by posting conspicuously that they're going to limit their liability to a certain amount of money and provide the guest with a safe, either in the room. Now modern hotels seem to have them all in their rooms. Not that I go to hotels that much, but that's my recollection in recent history. Almost every hotel has their own little safe within the rooms. But if not in the room, they will provide one for you behind the main desk. And there you're supposed to basically harbor your goods and your valuables and your money there. And if you don't, then they're alleviated under this common law principle to being strictly liable for loss or damage to your personal property while left in your hotel room. So again, it's kind of a reasonableness standard. It's pretty a duty to serve all. Don't get carried away on that. Yeah, they can't discriminate on race, color, creed, national origin. Anybody that comes in, if there's a room available, they have to rent it to them. But obviously, if someone comes in drunk or intoxicated or unruly or disruptive, the hotel management has the right to protect the current guests from having their senses and their well-being basically affronted to by unruly, intoxicated, or inappropriate behaving people. So serve all who are going to basically behave civilly. I guess we've got a better standard there. Duty to protect guest property. I'm not going to talk about the hotel leapers lien. It doesn't come up too much. So you say you're staying there for a week and you owe some balance and you basically skip out and no pay. And if you left some of the luggage behind and some clothing, they have a right to hold that. And for a period of time, they can actually sell it off later to help satisfy their hotel keeper's lien. It doesn't come up that much. Straightforward chapter, kind of dry, kind of boring. And what's the big thing I want you to get out of it? If you're the seller or the buyer of the goods, make clear who's going to bear liability during that transportation phase, if there is one involved. And just buy insurance. And if you're the seller and say, I don't want to buy insurance on this thing, I'm not making that much of a profit, say to the buyer, I'll sell you this good for X number of dollars, and I'm going to require as part of the purchase, you must buy insurance to the value upon which you're buying it in case something happens. It's all negotiable. You could put any of these kinds of clauses in the contract. It'll make you sleep easy. I know most of us don't do it, but on a bigger contract for a very expensive thing, I have a friend of mine who's into cars, and he occasionally spots one cross country. And there's companies, they're not public carriers, they're private, but nonetheless, these private carriers will bring the car from California back to Massachusetts. Same with boats. What do you want to do? You want to put in the contract who's going to bear the risk of loss between buyer and seller. And what else do you want to do? You want to put in who's going to buy insurance, and you're going to make sure somebody does have insurance on those goods so everyone can sleep easy. Usually insurance for something like that is pretty reasonable. It's not so prohibitive that we can't afford it. It's money well spent on a very high valued item. So keep that in mind. Hopefully this video was a little shorter. It's a little bit short chapter. Chapter 16, I believe, is somewhat similar. It's a whole new part, but it goes into sales. I can probably get through that tomorrow, I hope. Otherwise, try to have, say, a good weekend, but we're only on Tuesday. But have a good day, and we'll talk again soon.